Something significant is unfolding on a frontier most Americans never think about, and it matters far more than your evening news is letting on. Pakistan and Afghanistan are not simply exchanging border fire. What's happening right now between these two nations is a stress fracture in the entire post-American withdrawal architecture of Central Asia. When Islamabad launched Operation Ghazab Lil Haqq, which translates, and pay close attention to this, as the wrath for truth, it wasn't a defensive reflex, it was a calculated signal, a signal to Washington, to Beijing, to Moscow, and to every regional power watching carefully from the sidelines. Pakistan is telling the world it will no longer absorb cross-border aggression from TTP militants operating freely out of Afghan soil under Taliban protection. But here's what nobody is saying plainly: this operation is also a mirror reflecting the catastrophic consequences of America's chaotic 2021 withdrawal. Consequences that are now reshaping alliances, redrawing informal borders, and quietly pulling nuclear-armed Pakistan toward a breaking point the world cannot afford to ignore. And to understand why this matters so deeply, we need to go back, not just a few months, but decades. Pakistan and Afghanistan have never had a simple relationship. These are two nations bound together by geography, ethnicity, religion, and a shared colonial wound, the Durand Line, a border drawn by a British diplomat in 1893 that cut straight through Pashtun tribal lands without asking a single Pashtun whether they agreed. That line has been disputed ever since. Afghanistan has never formally recognized it as a legitimate international border, and that single unresolved historical grievance has poisoned every conversation, every negotiation, and every security arrangement between Islamabad and Kabul for over a century. So when people in Washington or Brussels look at what's happening right now and call it a border skirmish, they are missing the entire historical weight that sits underneath this conflict like a geological fault line. Now let's talk about what specifically triggered Operation Ghazab Lil Haqq, because context here is everything. For the past several years, Pakistan has been absorbing an accelerating wave of terrorist attacks on its own soil carried out by the Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, or the TTP, which is a separate organization from the Afghan Taliban, but deeply connected to it ideologically, financially, and in terms of sanctuary. The TTP operates out of Afghan territory. They plan their attacks in Afghanistan. They retreat into Afghanistan after striking Pakistani military posts, schools, mosques, and civilian markets. And the Afghan Taliban government in Kabul has consistently refused to crack down on them, offering instead diplomatic language that amounts to nothing more than polite deflection. Pakistan has communicated its frustration through every available channel: diplomatic notes, back-channel conversations, public statements from the Pakistani military. None of it produced meaningful results, and in the meantime, Pakistani soldiers kept dying. Pakistani civilians kept dying. The number of terrorist attacks inside Pakistan surged dramatically after the Taliban takeover in 2021, and that is not a coincidence. When the Taliban seized control of Afghanistan, they inherited enormous stockpiles of American weapons, they released thousands of fighters from prisons, and they created a permissive environment for groups like the TTP to operate with near-total freedom. Pakistan watched all of this unfold and understood that the strategic calculus had fundamentally shifted against them. So Islamabad made a decision. They launched Operation Ghazab Lil Haqq, the wrath for truth, a military operation involving airstrikes and ground operations targeting TTP positions inside Afghan territory. And the reaction from Kabul was immediate and fierce. The Taliban government condemned the strikes, called them a violation of Afghan sovereignty, and threatened retaliation. Afghan citizens near the strike zones reported civilian casualties, and suddenly what had been a slow-burning crisis became an open confrontation between two neighboring states, one of which is a nuclear power. Now, I want you to sit with that for a moment, because we are talking about a nuclear-armed state conducting military strikes inside the territory of a neighboring country governed by a radical Islamist movement that itself has connections to various militant networks across the region. The potential for escalation here is real. This isn't theoretical. And yet the international media coverage of this has been remarkably thin, remarkably shallow, and in many cases outright misleading. Let me explain what is actually at stake geopolitically, because this goes far beyond Pakistan and Afghanistan themselves. The entire Central and South Asian region is currently in the middle of a profound power realignment. The United States withdrew from Afghanistan in 2021 in what can only be described as a strategically incoherent manner, leaving behind not just military equipment, but an entire security vacuum. And nature abhors a vacuum. Into that vacuum have stepped China, Russia, Iran, and regional powers like Pakistan and India, each with their own agenda, each trying to shape what post-American Central Asia looks like. China has been particularly active. Beijing signed a security cooperation agreement with the Taliban government. Chinese companies have been negotiating mineral extraction deals in Afghanistan, which sits on what geologists estimate to be nearly $1 trillion in untapped mineral wealth, rare earth elements, lithium, copper, iron, gold. China wants access to those resources, and they want stability along their western frontier because instability in Afghanistan bleeds into Xinjiang, where Beijing is already fighting its own insurgency narrative. So China has a direct interest in keeping the Taliban government functional and internationally engaged. Russia, meanwhile, has its own calculations. Moscow has long viewed Central Asia as its near abroad, its sphere of historical influence. The Russians are not happy about Chinese expansion into the region, but they are even less happy about any scenario that brings American military presence back into Afghanistan or Pakistan. So Russia is playing a careful game, maintaining back-channel communication with the Taliban while also signaling to Pakistan that Moscow is a reliable partner. Russia and Pakistan have been growing closer in recent years, particularly in terms of energy trade, with Pakistan seeking to buy Russian oil at discounted prices following the Ukraine-related sanctions regime that reshuffled global energy flows. And then there is India, which watches everything happening in Pakistan with extraordinary attention. India and Pakistan remain in a state of deep strategic rivalry. They have fought multiple wars, they have come close to nuclear exchange more than once, and every significant development inside Pakistan gets analyzed in New Delhi through the lens of how it affects Indian security. India has actually cultivated a degree of influence inside Afghanistan historically, building infrastructure, funding institutions, maintaining relationships with Afghan civil society. The Taliban takeover largely ended that influence, which was a quiet strategic victory for Pakistan. But now, with Pakistan itself in military conflict with Afghanistan, India is recalibrating again, watching to see whether Pakistan's military overextension creates opportunities. So you see, what looks like a bilateral conflict between Pakistan and Afghanistan is actually a node in a much larger geopolitical network. Every action sends ripples outward across the entire region and eventually reaches the desks of decision-makers in Washington, Beijing, Moscow, and New Delhi. Now, let me talk about Pakistan's internal situation, because you cannot understand Operation Ghazab Lil Haqq without understanding the extraordinary domestic pressures that the Pakistani military and government are operating under right now. Pakistan is facing a severe economic crisis. The country went to the IMF for a bailout. Inflation has been crushing ordinary Pakistani families. The political situation is explosive. Imran Khan, the former prime minister, remains enormously popular despite being imprisoned, and his supporters represent a genuine mass movement that views the current military-backed establishment with deep suspicion and anger. The Pakistani state is, by almost any honest assessment, under tremendous stress from multiple directions simultaneously. In this context, the military launching a bold cross-border operation serves a domestic political purpose as well as a security one. It projects strength at a moment when strength is politically necessary. It rallies nationalist sentiment around the flag. It gives the military establishment a narrative: we are defending Pakistan, we are protecting Pakistani lives, at a time when its domestic legitimacy is being challenged in the streets and courtrooms. This is not to say the security threat from the TTP is manufactured. It is absolutely real, the death toll is absolutely real, but the timing and the scale of the operation also reflect internal political pressures that are impossible to separate from the security calculations. This is something Alex would emphasize, and I think it's worth emphasizing here too. Power never operates in a single dimension. Military operations are always simultaneously security decisions, political decisions, economic decisions, and sometimes even civilizational statements. Operation Ghazab Lil Haqq is all of these things at once. Let me also address something that rarely gets discussed in mainstream Western coverage of this conflict, and that is the question of American responsibility. When the United States spent 20 years in Afghanistan, it made promises, it made commitments, it built institutions, trained forces, armed militias, and told the Afghan people and the regional neighbors that America was a reliable long-term partner. And then in August 2021, it left, suddenly, chaotically, in scenes broadcast around the world that communicated something profound about American power, not its strength, but its limits, and perhaps more importantly, its willingness to abandon commitments when they become inconvenient. Pakistan, for all its complicated and often hypocritical relationship with American policy in Afghanistan, was left holding a very difficult bag after that withdrawal. The TTP surge that followed, the increased instability along the border, the flow of weapons and fighters, all of this was a direct consequence of the American exit strategy, or more accurately, the American exit without a strategy. And yet Washington has largely moved on, treating Afghanistan as a closed chapter, while the actual consequences continue to compound for the people living in the region. There is a moral accounting that needs to happen here that Western policy circles are very reluctant to engage in. Because if you take seriously the idea that American interventionism in Afghanistan, 2 decades of it, contributed directly to the conditions that produced both the Taliban's return and the TTP's resurgence, then the United States bears some degree of responsibility for the security crisis that is now forcing Pakistan into military strikes that are killing Afghan civilians. That chain of causation is real, it is documentable, and it is almost entirely absent from mainstream American discourse about this conflict. Now, what happens next? This is where things become genuinely uncertain, and I want to be honest with you about that uncertainty rather than give you false confidence. The Taliban government in Kabul has limited options for direct military retaliation against Pakistan. The Afghan military, such as it is under Taliban control, is not in a position to fight a conventional war against the Pakistani armed forces, which are far more capable, better equipped, and have nuclear deterrence behind them. So conventional escalation is unlikely. What is more likely is that the Taliban increases its support for the TTP, facilitates more cross-border attacks, and tries to make the cost of Pakistani military operations as high as possible through asymmetric means: terrorism, insurgency, economic disruption. Pakistan, on the other hand, needs to be careful about what success actually looks like here. You can conduct airstrikes, you can hit TTP camps, you can kill fighters, but you cannot bomb an ideology out of existence, and you cannot resolve a border dispute with missiles. Every strike that kills Afghan civilians creates new grievances, new recruitments, and new reasons for young Afghans to take up arms against Pakistan. The Pakistani military understands this, which is why the operation is framed in religious and moral language, wrath for truth, as an attempt to delegitimize the TTP's own religious framing and claim the moral high ground in what is partly a battle for the hearts and minds of Pashtun populations on both sides of the Durand Line. The broader regional powers will watch carefully and calibrate. China will quietly pressure both sides toward de-escalation because instability threatens Chinese investments and the Belt and Road corridor that runs through Pakistan. Russia will watch with interest, potentially using the crisis as leverage in its own negotiations with Western powers about spheres of influence. Iran, which shares a border with Afghanistan and has its own fraught relationship with the Taliban, will recalculate its position, and India will do what India always does: watch, wait, and look for strategic advantage. For ordinary Americans trying to understand this, the key takeaway is not the names and the specific operational details. The key takeaway is the pattern. This is a pattern you will see repeated across the globe in the coming years as American hegemonic power continues to retreat, and regional powers are forced to manage their own security environments without a reliable external guarantor. Pakistan doing what it is doing now is partly a function of American absence. The conflicts that will erupt in Eastern Europe, in the Middle East, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, they will increasingly follow this same pattern. Local powers, emboldened or desperate or both, taking actions they would have been deterred from taking when American power was at its zenith. And here is the deeper truth that I think is most important for an American audience to absorb. The world that is emerging is more multipolar, more dangerous in certain localized ways, and far less amenable to the kind of unilateral American management that defined the post-Cold War era. That is not necessarily a catastrophe. Multipolarity has existed before in history, and human civilization survived it. But it does require a fundamental rethinking of how America engages with the world, less assumption of dominance, more genuine diplomacy, more honest accounting of the consequences of past interventions, and more humility about what American power can and cannot achieve. Pakistan and Afghanistan are not simply two troubled countries fighting over a colonial border. They are a lens through which we can see the entire architecture of the post-Cold War international order straining under pressures it was never designed to handle. Operation Ghazab Lil Haqq is one loud crack in that architecture. It will not be the last. And the Americans who pay attention to these cracks, who try to understand them honestly rather than through the comfortable filter of American exceptionalism, are the ones who will be best positioned to understand and navigate what comes next. That is what this conflict is really about. Not just Pakistan, not just Afghanistan, not just the TTP or the Taliban or the Durand Line. It is about the shape of the world that is coming into being right now, while most people are distracted by domestic politics and entertainment. Pay attention, because the decisions being made on those mountain borders today will have consequences that reach much further than most people imagine.